Jake Morrison walked through the crystal halls of the Galactic Administrative Council building like he belonged there, and in many ways he did belong there after 3 long years of pretending to be someone else. The massive towers on Zentara. Prime reached up into the purple sky and housed the most powerful government in the known galaxy. Jake carried his data tablet close to his chest and wore the same boring gray uniform that thousands of other workers wore every single day. Nobody looked at him twice because Jake had become invisible in the best possible way. He was just another clerk among the endless sea of clerks who kept the galactic government running smoothly. His alien disguise was perfect down to the smallest detail, and even the most advanced security scanners could not tell that he was actually human. The surgeries had been painful, and the bioimplants felt strange under his fake Zentaran skin, but they were worth every moment of discomfort. The Galactic Council thought humans were nothing more than primitive animals who had barely learned to use fire when they first made contact 50 years ago. Earth had been given basic technology and one tiny seat in the massive council chambers in exchange for raw materials and young humans to serve as soldiers in alien wars. The aliens believed they were being generous by allowing humans to exist at all. What the council did not know was that humans had been watching them and learning about them for much longer than 50 years. Secret human intelligence services had been studying alien behavior and technology since the very first contact. They had learned alien languages and customs, and most importantly, they had learned how to blend in without being noticed. Jake was one of the best agents that Earth had ever produced. His mission was simple in theory, but incredibly dangerous in practice. He needed to gather information about alien plans for humanity and find weaknesses in the galactic government that could be used if war ever came. The aliens saw humans as useful pets at best and dangerous animals at worst, but they never suspected that a human could be smart enough to fool their security systems. The council building operated like a massive machine with each alien species, handling different jobs based on what the leadership thought they were good at. The bug-like Threx managed all the shipping and supply chains because they were organized and efficient. The cloud-like Nultai handled communications between different worlds because they could process multiple conversations at the same time. The crystal beings called Zentarans controlled all the money and financial decisions because they were supposed to be logical and fair. Jake had studied this system for 3 years, and he was starting to see problems that the aliens could not see. Each species only talked to their own kind most of the time, and they rarely shared information with other species unless they absolutely had to. The Threx logistics teams did not really understand how Zentran banking worked, and the Zentrans did not care about the details of Nultai communication networks. This separation was supposed to make the government more efficient, but Jake could see that it actually made the whole system weak. If something went wrong in one area, it could cause problems in all the other areas, because nobody understood how all the pieces fit together. The aliens thought their specialization made them strong, but Jake was beginning to think it might be the thing that could destroy them. Every day, Jake walked through the halls and listened to conversations and read documents that were supposed to be secret. He memorized shipping schedules and trade agreements and military deployment orders. He learned which officials were corrupt and which ones were honest and which ones were just trying to survive in a system that was much bigger than any one person could control. The work was boring most of the time, but Jake knew that boring work often led to the most important discoveries. He had already uncovered 3 different corruption scandals and 2 illegal weapons development programs just by paying attention to financial records that nobody else bothered to read carefully. Jake also spent time watching how different alien species interacted with each other during meetings and social events. He noticed that the Threx got annoyed when Zentrans questioned their logistics plans, and the Zentrans became defensive when anyone suggested their financial calculations might be wrong. The Nultai seemed to think they were smarter than everyone else, because they could process information faster. These small tensions and prejudices were normal in any large organization, but Jake wondered what would happen if those tensions were pushed a little harder. What would happen if the different species stopped trusting each other completely? What would happen if they started working against each other instead of together? Jake had been trained to think like a spy, but he was also human, and humans were good at seeing patterns that other species missed. Humans were also good at adapting to new situations and finding creative solutions to impossible problems. The aliens had given humans a small place in their government because they thought humans were weak, but they had made a serious mistake. They had underestimated what humans could do when they were motivated to protect their home and their families. Jake carried the weight of his entire species on his shoulders as he walked through those crystal halls every day, and he was determined to find a way to keep Earth safe no matter what it cost him personally. Jake Morrison was transferring routine shipping data from one computer system to another when he accidentally accessed a file. That changed everything he thought he knew about the galactic government and humanity's place in it. The file was buried deep in the classified archives, and it should have been impossible for someone with his security clearance to reach it, but a glitch in the system had opened a door that was supposed to stay locked forever. The document was labeled Order 847, Delta, and as Jake read through the cold clinical language, he felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. This was not just another boring government memo about trade regulations or tax policies. This was a detailed plan to systematically harvest human genetic material for military enhancement programs that would ultimately lead to the complete extinction of his species. The plan was laid out in careful stages that would take place over the next several years. Human colonies on the outer rim would be gradually evacuated under the cover of voluntary relocation programs that were supposed to protect humans from dangerous cosmic radiation or hostile alien species. The relocated humans would disappear into research facilities where their DNA would be extracted and analyzed and combined with alien genetic material to create super soldiers. The new hybrid warriors would have human adaptability and creativity, combined with alien strength and technology. They would be perfect soldiers who could think like humans but fight like the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. The original humans would not be needed once the hybrid program was complete, and Earth itself was scheduled for something called ecological restructuring, which was a polite way of saying total destruction. Jake had to read the document 3 times before he could fully understand what he was seeing. The aliens did not see humans as partners or even as useful servants. They saw humans as a natural resource to be mined and processed and thrown away when they were no longer useful. The friendly cooperation between Earth and the Galactic Council was nothing more than a lie designed to keep humans calm while they were led to slaughter. The timeline in the document showed that the first major relocations would begin in less than 2 years, and Earth would be restructured in just 23 months. Jake realized that his original mission to gather intelligence and report back to Earth was now completely useless, because by the time any rescue mission could be organized, it would be far too late to save anyone. Jake spent the next several hours copying every piece of information he could find about Order 847 Delta and related programs. He discovered that similar extinction plans existed for at least 6 other species that the Council considered to be inferior or dangerous. The galaxy was much darker and more evil than anyone on Earth had ever imagined. But Jake also found something else in those classified files that gave him a small spark of hope. The galactic government was not as strong and unified as it appeared to be on the surface. There were hundreds of internal reports about disputes between different alien species and complaints about unfair treatment and accusations of corruption and incompetence at every level of the bureaucracy. The Threx logistics coordinators were constantly fighting with Zentran financial officers about budget allocations and shipping priorities. The Newell-Tide communication specialists believed they were being deliberately excluded from important decision-making processes. Even the ruling council members seemed to spend more time arguing with each other than actually governing the galaxy. Jake began to see the government structure in a completely different way than he had before. A specialization that made each species focus on specific jobs had created a system where nobody really understood how the whole thing worked. Each group was so focused on their own responsibilities that they had no idea what the other groups were doing or why they were doing it. This isolation had created perfect conditions for misunderstandings and conflicts between different species. The Threks thought the Zentrans were trying to sabotage shipping operations by cutting budgets. The Zentrans thought the Threks were wasting money on unnecessary equipment and inefficient routes. The Newell-Tide thought everyone else was too stupid to understand their superior communication methods. Jake realized that these natural tensions could be used as weapons against the government if they were carefully managed and pushed in the right directions. He did not need to build bombs or recruit armies or start open warfare against the aliens. He just needed to help them destroy themselves by turning their own prejudices and fears against each other. The plan that began forming in Jake's mind was both simple and incredibly complex at the same time. He would use his position as a low-level clerk to plant small pieces of false information that would make each alien species believe that the others were working against them. He would create fake evidence of corruption and sabotage and betrayal that would drive the different groups apart. The beauty of this approach was that Jake would never have to do anything that looked suspicious or dangerous. He would just be a humble clerk making small mistakes and minor errors that could happen to anyone who worked with large amounts of data every day. Nobody would suspect that a primitive human could be smart enough to manipulate the most advanced government in galactic history. Jake knew that his plan would take time and patience and incredible attention to detail. He would have to be very careful not to push too hard or too fast, because that might expose him before he could complete his mission. But he also knew that time was running out for humanity, and every day he delayed meant more humans would die in the alien research facilities. Jake deleted all traces of his unauthorized access to the classified files and returned to his normal work routine, but his mind was already racing with possibilities. He had found the weakness in the galactic government, and now he needed to exploit that weakness before it was too late to save Earth and all the other species that the Council had marked for extinction. The aliens thought they were so much smarter than humans, but they had made one critical error. They had allowed a human to see their true plans, and now that human was going to use everything he had learned against them. Jake Morrison was no longer just gathering intelligence for Earth. He was going to single-handedly bring down the most powerful government in the galaxy without firing a single shot. Jake Morrison began his campaign to destroy the galactic government with something so simple that nobody would ever suspect it was deliberate sabotage. As a clerk in the Resource Allocation Department, he had access to thousands of shipping manifests and supply orders and inventory databases that kept the entire galaxy running smoothly. Jake started making tiny changes to these records that individually meant nothing but together would create chaos throughout the galactic supply network. He changed delivery dates by just a few days here and there so that mining operations would run out of essential equipment right when they needed it most. He rerouted supply shipments to the wrong facilities so that military bases would receive food supplies instead of ammunition, and agricultural colonies would get weapons instead of farming equipment. He adjusted inventory numbers by small percentages so that warehouse managers would think they had more supplies than they actually possessed. Each individual change was so minor that it could easily be explained as a simple data entry error or computer glitch. No single mistake was big enough to trigger security investigations or cause anyone to suspect deliberate sabotage. But Jake knew that small errors could cascade into much larger problems when they happened across multiple systems at the same time. The first major failure occurred at a plasma mining operation on Kepler 442b, where the miners ran out of cutting torches just as they broke through into the richest ore deposit they had ever discovered. The delay cost the operation millions of credits and forced them to shut down for 3 weeks while new equipment was shipped from across the galaxy. The mine supervisors blamed the logistics department for the supply failure. A military shipyard in the Vega system received the wrong grade of hull plating for 3 new Dreadnought-class warships, which forced construction crews to halt work until the correct materials could be delivered. The project fell 6 months behind schedule, and the shipyard commanders accused the supply coordinators of incompetence and possible corruption. Food shipments began arriving spoiled at colony worlds because Jake had rerouted them through systems where the preservation systems were not compatible with the cargo containers. Thousands of colonists went hungry while emergency food supplies were rushed in from other systems at enormous expense. The colony governors demanded investigations into what they called criminal negligence by the shipping authorities. Jake watched. These failures cascade through the government bureaucracy with growing satisfaction. The beauty of his approach was that each alien species blamed the other species for the problems, instead of looking for a single cause. The Threx logistics coordinators insisted that their shipping calculations were perfect, and the problems must be caused by incorrect information from the Zentran financial databases. The Zentrans responded by claiming that their budget allocations were mathematically flawless, and the Threx must be deliberately mismanaging resources to hide their own inefficiency. The Null-Tai communication specialists said that their message networks were operating normally, and any confusion must be caused by poor planning from both the Threx and the Zentrans. Jake carefully stoked these growing tensions by planting additional evidence that suggested deliberate sabotage between the different species. He modified shipping orders to include insulting comments about Zentran mathematical abilities that appeared to come from Threx logistics officers. He created fake communication transcripts that showed Null-Tai operators making jokes about how stupid the other species were during official government business. The evidence was subtle enough to be believable, but offensive enough to make each species angry at the others. Jake made sure that the fake insults played on real prejudices and stereotypes that already existed between the different alien groups. The Threx had always thought the Zentrans were arrogant and condescending. The Zentrans believed the Threx were crude and unsophisticated. The Null-Tai considered themselves intellectually superior to everyone else in the galaxy. Within 6 months of Jake beginning his sabotage campaign, the 3 major species that ran the galactic government were barely speaking to each other except to trade accusations and demands for investigations. Emergency meetings were called almost every week to address the growing supply chain failures, but these meetings usually ended with shouting matches between species representatives. The rigid hierarchy that had once been the Council's greatest strength was now working against them, as each species retreated into defensive positions and refused to share information with the others. The Threx stopped providing detailed shipping manifests to the Zentrans, claiming that financial oversight was being used to steal trade secrets. The Zentrans began conducting independent audits of Threx operations without informing them in advance. Jake used his access to military databases to identify the most critical supply lines and communication hubs in the Galactic Defense Network. He began planning more sophisticated attacks that would target these strategic points during the next phase of his operation. But he was careful to continue making his changes look like random errors and equipment failures, rather than coordinated attacks. The aliens still had no idea that a human agent was working among them, because they could not imagine that any human would be smart enough or skilled enough to penetrate their security systems. They continued to see humans as primitive creatures, who were barely capable of understanding basic technology, let alone manipulating complex galactic bureaucracies. This blind spot was exactly what Jake had been counting on when he first conceived his plan. The aliens' own prejudices and assumptions about human intelligence were preventing them from seeing the truth, even when the evidence was right in front of them. They would rather believe that their own people were incompetent or corrupt than admit that a human could outwit their most advanced security measures. Jake knew that the worst was yet to come as he prepared to escalate his campaign into the next phase. The supply chain failures were just the beginning of what would become a complete breakdown of trust between the alien species that controlled the galaxy. He had identified the weak points in their government structure, and now he was going to systematically attack those weak points until the entire system collapsed under its own weight. The aliens thought they were dealing with random accidents and bureaucratic incompetence, but Jake Morrison was methodically destroying their civilization from the inside. And the best part was that they were helping him do it by turning against each other, exactly as he had planned from the very beginning. 6 months after Jake Morrison began his quiet war against the galactic government, the first major political crisis erupted when the Threx Logistics Guild formally accused the Zendron Finance Ministry of deliberately sabotaging shipping operations to drive up costs and increase their control over interstellar trade. The accusation came during what was supposed to be a routine budget meeting, but quickly escalated into the worst diplomatic incident between allied species in over 50 years. Guildmaster Vex Korth of the Threx delegation presented a detailed report showing dozens of instances where Zentrin budget cuts had directly caused supply chain failures across multiple star systems. The report included shipping manifests that had been altered without Threx approval and financial records that showed suspicious timing between budget adjustments and critical supply shortages. What the Threx did not know was that Jake had carefully crafted every piece of evidence in their report, using his access to both Threx and Zentrin computer systems. He had created a perfect trail of fake documents that made it look like the Zentrins were engaged in economic warfare against their longtime allies. Finance Director Quen 9847 of the Zentrin delegation responded to the accusations with barely contained rage that crystalline beings rarely showed in public. She accused the Threx of gross financial incompetence and suggested that their shipping failures were actually elaborate schemes to hide massive corruption within the Logistics Guild. The Zentrins immediately froze all funding for Threx operations, pending a complete audit of their accounts. The conflict between the two most powerful administrative species in the galaxy sent shockwaves through every government department and military command. Trade agreements that had been stable for decades were suddenly suspended as both sides demanded new terms that would protect them from what they saw as deliberate sabotage by their former partners. Jake watched the emergency council sessions from his clerk's desk as species representatives shouted at each other in languages that their translation systems could barely handle. The careful diplomatic protocols that had maintained peace for generations were breaking down as suspicion and paranoia replaced trust and cooperation. But Jake was not finished with his manipulation of interspecies relations. His next target was the Null-Tie communication network, which handled all official messages between government departments and military units across the galaxy. Jake had been studying their systems for months and had discovered that their pride in communication security was actually a weakness he could exploit. Using stolen access codes, Jake planted fake communications that suggested the Null-Tie were selling government secrets to independent traders and hostile alien nations. The messages were crafted to look like internal Null-Tie discussions about which classified information would be most valuable to foreign buyers and how to hide their activities from other government agencies. When these fake communications were discovered during a routine security audit, the response from other species was immediate and devastating. The Nultai had built their entire identity around being trustworthy, guardians of sensitive information, and the suggestion that they were. Traitors cut deeper than any physical attack could have, the gaseous beings who made up the Nultai communication. Network reacted to the accusations by implementing new encryption protocols that made interspecies coordination almost impossible. They claimed that they needed to protect themselves from infiltration by hostile agents, but the practical effect was to isolate them from the rest of the government. Jake had successfully turned the three pillars of galactic government against each other, using nothing more than carefully planted false evidence and their own prejudices. The Threks believed the Zentrans were sabotaging their operations for financial gain. The Zentrans thought the Threks were corrupt thieves who could not be trusted with public resources. The Nultai were convinced that everyone else was trying to steal their secrets and undermine their authority. The breakdown in cooperation had immediate effects on government operations throughout the galaxy. Military units began receiving contradictory orders from different command structures as the various species tried to protect their own interests. Supply lines that had operated smoothly for decades ground to a halt as each group demanded oversight of the others. Activities. Colony worlds found themselves caught in the middle of bureaucratic wars as different species agencies refused to coordinate with each other. Food shipments were delayed because Threx logistics coordinators would not accept Zentran shipping authorizations. Communication blackouts occurred when Nultai operators refused to relay messages between Threx and Zentran facilities. Jake realized that the time had come for his masterstroke against the government leadership itself. He had been carefully studying the personal financial records of the ruling council members and had identified several opportunities to create scandals that would destroy their credibility completely, using the same techniques he had perfected. Over months of sabotage, Jake created evidence that Chancellor Vex Prime had been embezzling funds meant for military upgrades and using the money to build luxury facilities on his home world. The evidence was built on real financial discrepancies that Jake had been creating through his supply chain manipulation, but it painted a picture of systematic corruption at the highest levels of government. Jake also fabricated documents showing that Council Speaker Vrulo 9 had been manipulating trade agreements to benefit corporations owned by his family, while forcing smaller companies out of business through discriminatory regulations. The fake evidence was supported by real economic data that showed suspicious patterns in government contracts and licensing decisions. When these scandals broke simultaneously across every major news network in the galaxy, the effect was like a bomb exploding in the heart of the galactic government. Species that had already been suspicious of each other now had proof that their leaders were criminals who could not be trusted with any authority. Emergency investigations were launched by every major species delegation, but these investigations only made the crisis worse as each group accused the others of covering up evidence and protecting corrupt officials. The council chambers became a battlefield where former allies screamed accusations at each other while their civilizations watched. In horror, Jake Morrison continued his work as a humble data clerk while the government he had infiltrated tore itself apart around him. He had accomplished something that no military force in galactic history had ever managed to achieve. He had brought the most powerful government in the known universe to the brink of total collapse without firing a single shot or revealing his true identity to anyone. The aliens had always underestimated human intelligence and creativity, and now they were paying the price for that arrogance. Jake had used their own systems and prejudices against them so effectively that they were destroying themselves while he watched from the shadows. As the galactic government collapsed around him, Jake Morrison prepared for the most dangerous phase of his operation by reaching out to species that had been forgotten and ignored by the ruling council for generations. During his 3 years of infiltration, Jake had discovered that humans were not the only ones being exploited by the so-called civilized galaxy, and this knowledge gave him the opportunity to create something much more powerful than simple chaos: the rigid hierarchy that favored certain species over others had created vast inequalities throughout the galaxy that most citizens never saw or understood. While the Threks and Zenturons and Nultai controlled the major government departments, dozens of other species provided labor and resources and military service while receiving minimal representation in the political system that controlled their lives. Jake had identified at least 30 different species that had legitimate grievances against the Galactic Council, including the Aquani, water farmers who supplied fresh water to hundreds of worlds but were paid barely enough to survive, the silicon-based Keth miners who extracted rare minerals from asteroid belts under dangerous conditions for wages that had not increased in over 20 years, the nomadic Zeph traders who transported goods between distant systems but were restricted by regulations that favored larger corporations owned by council species. Using his access to government communication networks, Jake began reaching out to representatives of these oppressed groups through carefully anonymous channels. He did not reveal his identity as a human agent, but presented himself as a concerned government bureaucrat who had discovered evidence of systematic discrimination and exploitation. Jake shared intelligence about how council resources were being diverted away from programs that were supposed to help smaller species and into projects that benefited only the ruling groups. He provided detailed financial records showing how water rights had been sold to private Centuran corporations without consulting the Aquani communities who depended on those resources for survival. The response to Jake's revelations was immediate and overwhelming. Species leaders who had been quietly suffering under council rule for decades suddenly had proof that their suspicions about discrimination were completely justified. Mining communities that had wondered why their working conditions never improved despite promises from government officials now understood that safety regulations were being deliberately ignored to increase profits for council-owned mining companies. Jake coordinated these growing independence movements using the same bureaucratic channels he had used to create chaos within the government hierarchy. He provided shipping schedules that showed when council supply lines would be most vulnerable to disruption. He identified sympathetic officials within various government departments who might be willing to help coordinate resistance activities. Most importantly, Jake helped different oppressed species groups communicate with each other and realize that they were not alone in their struggles against council oppression. The Aquani water farmers discovered that the Keth miners were facing similar exploitation in their industry. The Zeph traders learned that their shipping restrictions were part of a broader pattern of economic discrimination against non-council species. What emerged from these connections was something that terrified the remaining council leadership more than any military threat could have. Instead of dozens of separate grievances from individual species groups, the council now faced a coordinated galaxy-wide uprising of oppressed peoples who understood that they had been systematically cheated and lied to for generations. Mining worlds declared independence when evidence surfaced that their mineral rights had been sold to private corporations without their consent or knowledge. Agricultural colonies stopped shipping food to council worlds when they learned that their products were being marked up by 400% before reaching consumers. Transportation unions went on strike when they discovered that shipping regulations were designed to eliminate competition from smaller companies. Jake provided crucial intelligence support to these independence movements by sharing information about council military deployments and supply vulnerabilities. He helped coordinate timing between different groups so that their actions would have maximum impact on government operations. When council forces tried to suppress one uprising, Jake made sure that 3 more would break out simultaneously in different parts of the galaxy. The fractured council leadership tried desperately to respond to the growing crisis, but their complete breakdown in cooperation made any unified strategy impossible. Some Threx officials wanted to crush the rebellions with military force, while others preferred to negotiate new agreements that might preserve some of their authority. The Zentarans were divided between those who wanted to use economic sanctions and those who believed they should offer financial incentives to restore order. The Nultai communication network was so focused on protecting their own secrets that they refused to coordinate with either the Threx or Zentaran response efforts. This isolation meant that Council military units often received contradictory orders from different command structures, while the rebellion spread faster than any single species could track or contain. Jake realized that his mission had evolved far beyond simply protecting Earth from extinction. He was now helping to create a new galactic order based on equality and cooperation, rather than the hierarchy and exploitation that had characterized Council rule. The oppressed species were not just fighting for independence from their former masters, but working together to build something better than what had come before. But Jake also knew that his work was far from finished, because the Council still controlled significant military resources and might be able to restore order if the rebellion lost momentum. He needed to deliver one final blow that would make it impossible for the old system to ever recover its power and authority. The opportunity came when Jake gained access to the most classified archives in the government database, including detailed records of every illegal program and planned atrocity that the Council had authorized over the past century. The Order 847 Delta documents that had first revealed the plan to exterminate humanity were just the beginning of what Jake discovered in those hidden files. The evidence showed that the Council had been planning similar extinction programs for at least 6 other species and had already carried out covert genocide campaigns against 3 civilizations that had refused to accept Council authority. There were detailed records of biological weapons, research, and forced sterilization programs and mass relocations that had ended in death camps. Jake prepared to release all of this evidence simultaneously across every communication network in the galaxy, knowing that the revelations would destroy any remaining legitimacy that the Council might still possess. The final phase of his operation would not just bring down the current government, but ensure that nothing like it could ever rise again. The end of the galactic government came not with explosions or battle fleets, but with a simple resignation letter that Chancellor Vex Prime transmitted to every news network in the galaxy at exactly noon on a Tuesday. Jake Morrison watched from his clerk station as the most powerful being in known space, admitted defeat in language that was remarkably humble for someone who had controlled the fate of nearly 1,000 worlds just days before. Vex Prime's resignation cited his inability to maintain order and unity within the Council structure, and his failure to address the legitimate grievances of oppressed species throughout the galaxy. He took full responsibility for the corruption scandals that had destroyed public trust in government institutions, and announced that he would be returning to his home world to face whatever legal consequences awaited him there. Within 6 hours of the Chancellor's resignation, every remaining member of the ruling Council had followed his example. Council Speaker of Rule 9 stepped down while facing criminal investigations in 12 different star systems. Finance Director Quen 9847 resigned after her own species delegation voted to remove her from office for bringing shame upon the Zentaran people. Guildmaster Vexcorth of the Threx abandoned his position when it became clear that his logistics empire was collapsing under the weight of rebellion and economic sanctions. Jake watched the last transport ships depart from Zentara Prime, carrying former government officials back to their home worlds, where many of them would face prosecution for crimes that Jake had carefully documented and revealed. The massive crystal towers that had housed the galactic government for over 3 centuries stood empty and dark as their computer systems were systematically wiped clean by departing administrators trying to hide evidence of their failures. But Jake had been preparing for this moment throughout his entire operation, and he was not about to let the most important evidence disappear into digital oblivion. As the government buildings emptied around him, Jake activated hidden data collection programs that he had been installing for months. Every classified document and secret communication and illegal order was copied to secure storage systems that Jake controlled completely. The final data package that Jake released to news networks throughout the galaxy contained evidence of crimes so shocking that even species who had supported the Council were horrified by what they learned. The Order 847 Delta documents showed the world that humans had been scheduled for complete extinction within 2 years. Similar extermination plans existed for the Aquani and Keth and Zeph and 3 other species that the Council had decided were too dangerous or troublesome to be allowed to survive. The evidence went far beyond just future plans for genocide. Jake's archives contained proof that the Council had already carried out secret extermination campaigns against civilizations that had refused to accept galactic authority. Entire species had been wiped out through biological weapons and engineered plagues and systematic starvation, while the rest of the galaxy was told that these extinctions were caused by natural disasters or primitive warfare. The revelations triggered outrage that crossed species, boundaries, and political divisions throughout the galaxy. Even former Council loyalists demanded justice for the victims of government atrocities. Species that had barely known Earth existed expressed solidarity with humanity and promised to help protect human colonies from any future attempts at extermination. Jake finally activated his emergency extraction beacon, knowing that his mission was complete and his cover would not protect him much longer as investigators began looking for the source of the leaked classified documents. A human intelligence ship that had been waiting at the edge of the Zentara system for 3 years began moving toward the planet to pick up the most successful spy in human history. As Jake prepared to abandon his alien disguise and return to his true identity, he composed a final mission report that would become legendary within Earth's intelligence services. The report was brief and modest, considering the magnitude of what Jake had accomplished, but it captured the essential facts of his operation in language that his supervisors would understand. Mission accomplished, Jake wrote in his report. Galactic Council dissolved through internal conflicts and revealed corruption. Human extinction order canceled due to government collapse. All oppressed species now free to form new governments based on equality rather than hierarchy. Recommend immediate diplomatic outreach to establish multilateral cooperation agreements with liberated worlds. The ship that retrieved Jake Morrison from Zentara Prime carried much more than just one agent returning home from a successful mission. It carried the seeds of a completely new galactic order where humans would be partners and allies rather than servants or victims. The old system of species hierarchy and systematic oppression had been destroyed so thoroughly that it could never be rebuilt. Jake had spent 3 years learning to think and act like an alien bureaucrat, but in the end, it was his fundamentally human ability to see connections and patterns that others missed which had brought down the most powerful government in galactic history. While the aliens focused on their specialized roles and narrow responsibilities, Jake had seen the bigger picture and understood how all the pieces fit together. The galaxy would never underestimate human intelligence or creativity again, because Jake Morrison had proven that sometimes the most devastating weapon is simply knowing how to turn an enemy's strengths into fatal weaknesses. He had accomplished something that no army or fleet could have achieved by using patience and planning and careful observation instead of violence and destruction. Years later, when historians studied the fall of the galactic government, they would struggle to understand how such a powerful and advanced civilization could have collapsed so completely without any external military pressure. The truth was that Jake Morrison had destroyed their government, using nothing more than their own bureaucratic systems and their prejudices against each other. The aliens had built a government so complex and specialized that no single species understood how it actually worked. Jake had used that complexity against them by creating small problems that cascaded into larger failures, which ultimately destroyed the trust and cooperation that held their civilization together. Jake Morrison returned to Earth as a hero, but he knew that his real victory was not the destruction of the old government, but the opportunity he had created for something better to take its place. The galaxy was now free to build a new future based on equality and mutual respect rather than domination and exploitation. And it had all been accomplished by one human who refused to accept that his species was inferior to anyone else in the universe.